I have lived on this street for almost 30 years, and for most of that time, nothing truly surprised me. Life rolled along in small, predictable ways. And then my neighbor died, and everything I thought I knew about my street shifted. His name, as far as I knew, was Walter Green. He lived 3 houses down in a small stucco house like any other in our Arizona suburb, and for 20 years he was part of the background of my life. He was the kind of neighbor people described as quiet. He waved when he checked the mail, kept the same unremarkable silver sedan, never had visitors or noisy holidays, and his house stayed dark while everyone else's driveways glowed with sparklers. I did not think he was lonely. I thought he was content. It is funny how easy it is to accept silence as a personality trait rather than a clue. The morning I realized something was wrong began like any other. I brewed coffee, fed the dog, and stepped outside in my robe to pick up the newspaper. As I bent to grab it, I noticed Walter's trash cans. They were still at the curb. It was Thursday. Our trash pickup is on Wednesday, and Walter was the kind of man who did the same things the same way every week. His cans were always rolled back to the side of his house by mid-morning on pickup day. Something about those 2 blue bins sitting at the curb 24 hours late made a thin thread of unease tighten in my chest. I tried to be reasonable. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe he had gone out of town. Maybe a relative had come and whisked him away, although I had never seen a relative in 2 decades. Then I noticed his porch light. It was still on. The desert sun made it hard to see, but the little amber bulb glowed faintly against the stucco. It had been on the night before, too. I remembered because I had taken the dog out late and noticed it. People forget porch lights. People also forget to pull in trash cans when they are lying on the bathroom floor or passed out in front of the television. I had stood in that exact place once, years earlier, staring at my own overfull mailbox and thinking that if anything ever happened to me, someone would notice. So I walked down the sidewalk. The gravel in front of Walter's house crunched under my slippers. The windows were shut, blinds closed, no movement inside. The silver sedan sat in the driveway, a thin layer of dust on the windshield. I did not knock at first. I just stood there listening, expecting to hear a television or the hum of a fan. There was nothing. When I finally knocked, I did it lightly, then harder, then called his name. I did not shout, but my voice felt too loud in the stillness. Nothing. There is a point between concern and panic where your mind starts filling in possibilities on its own. Him lying on the floor, him having fallen, him in need of help that I was too late to provide. I stood there longer than I should have, arguing with myself, and then my practicality won out. I went back to my house, found the non-emergency number for the local police, and explained the situation. Elderly neighbor, unusual behavior, no answer at the door. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. I watched from my front window as they approached Walter's door, knocked, called out, then forced the lock. They were inside a long time. I knew before they came back out. One of them walked over to my house, his face carefully sympathetic. I recognized that look from the worst day of my own life, 15 years earlier, when someone in a uniform had told me my husband would not be coming home from work. He told me that Walter had passed away. They believed it had been several days. Natural causes, they said. No sign of foul play, as if the absence of violence made death less heavy for the living. I nodded, thanked them, answered a few more questions. How long had I known him? When had I last seen him? Had I noticed anything unusual? My answers were embarrassingly thin. I had known him for 20 years and could not tell them his birthday, his middle name, or where he had lived before he moved here. After they left, the street settled into an uncanny quiet, like a picture hung just a little crooked on the wall. Over the next few days, a routine unfolded. An unmarked van arrived. Two men in plain clothes went in and out of Walter's house, carrying clipboards and plastic containers. Later, there was a sedan with county plates. Someone taped a notice to the front door. The trash cans were finally moved, not back to the side of the house, but onto the driveway. Neighbors did what neighbors do. We talked in lowered voices at mailboxes and over fences. People said it was sad, but at least he had gone peacefully. They speculated about relatives, about wills, about what would happen to the house. They mentioned how quiet he had been, how polite, how he always waved. No one claimed to have known him well. I kept thinking about that. It bothered me that a man could live among us for 2 decades and leave so few impressions beyond vague adjectives: quiet, polite, friendly enough. The words felt thin, like tissue paper. A week later, I saw the estate people. It started with a laminated sign zip-tied to the stop sign at the corner. Estate sale. This Saturday, 8 a.m., an arrow pointing down our street. There was something strange about seeing Walter's life summarized in those 2 words. Estate sale. Everything he had owned was about to be spread out and priced. On Saturday morning, the street filled with cars. Some of my neighbors wandered over, curiosity outweighing discomfort. I went too, telling myself it was practical. Someone should be there who remembered his porch light. The front door stood open, propped by a folding chair. A printed list on the wall said the sale was being handled by a company out of Phoenix. Inside, the air smelled like dust and faint lemon cleaner. Strangers moved through Walter's rooms with the efficient focus of people sorting through someone else's past for useful pieces. His living room and kitchen were neat and almost impersonal. Basic furniture, a few dishes, a stocked fridge, but no family photos, no drawings, no wedding portrait. It felt more like a motel than a home. I moved down the hallway with the other shoppers, feeling like an intruder. Each bedroom had been staged for the sale. Clothes on racks, shoes lined up, sets of sheets folded on the beds. In the smallest bedroom, a card table held tools and extension cords and labeled bags of screws and nails. There was nothing deeply personal. No diaries, no letters, no framed certificates. It was as if he had deliberately edited his life down to functional items. In the master bedroom, I noticed something that stopped me. On the dresser, next to a stack of t-shirts, was a small wooden box. Dark wood, brass hinges, a little latch. A strip of blue painter's tape on the lid read, "Jewelry box, $10. I do not know why I reached for it. My hands shook a little as I lifted the lid. I had expected rings, watches, maybe a broken chain or 2. I did not expect passports. They were stacked inside like a deck of cards, at least a dozen of them. Different colors, different years. Some older, worn at the edges, others almost new. A few had rubber bands around them with sticky notes attached, each note with a year or a short phrase in careful handwriting. I glanced around. No one seemed to be watching me. I picked up the first passport and opened it. The photo showed a younger version of Walter. Slightly darker hair, fewer lines in his face, but unmistakably him. The name above the photo was not. It was not the name on the notice posted to his door. It was not the name on the estate sale sign. It was not any name I had ever heard associated with him. I picked up another passport. Same face, different name. A third, same photo, slightly older. Another name. My stomach dropped. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Identity theft, maybe. Someone had used his image. Maybe he collected old passports for some reason. Then I saw the driver's licenses. They were in the bottom of the box beneath the passports, held together with a thick rubber band. Dozens of them, all with the same face, slightly older or younger in each. different names, different addresses, different states, some far away, some alarmingly close. Whatever reasonable explanations my mind had been trying to construct crumbled. I closed the lid of the box slowly and set it back on the dresser, trying to make my hands look casual. My heart was beating too fast. I did not buy the box. Instead, I found the woman running the sale. I described what I had seen in neutral terms and watched her expression change. Her friendly saleswoman face tightened. She closed the box herself and carried it into the back room, away from the shoppers. For the rest of the morning, it nagged at me. When I finally walked back to my own house, my mind felt like a kaleidoscope of questions, all shifting, none forming a clear pattern. Who had he been? Or, more accurately, how many people had he been? Over the next few days, the estate sale ended, the company cleared out what remained, and the house settled into a hollow quiet. Curtains pulled back, rooms empty, walls bare. A for sale sign appeared in the yard. Our street went back to its usual rhythm, but I could not. I kept thinking about that box, about the faces in those photographs, all the same man living multiple lives. I found myself watching the empty house when I took the dog for a walk, as if someone might step out of it and explain everything. Of course, no one did. Most people would have let it go. I did not. Maybe because I am at an age where the idea of someone leaving this world as a question bothers me more than it used to. Maybe because I have lived alone long enough that mysteries feel louder in the quiet. Maybe because grief rearranges your sense of what matters, and after losing my husband, unfinished stories began to bother me more than I expected. Whatever the reason, I decided to find out who my neighbor had really been. I started with what little I knew, the name on his mailbox and the estate sale sign, Walter Green. The years he had lived on our street. The fact that he looked to be in his 70s when he died. I figured I could at least confirm whether Walter Green existed in any official sense beyond that laminated sign. I went online and searched public records. Eventually, I found a property tax record for the house. It listed the owner as Walter J. Green, purchase date 20 years earlier. The mailing address matched the house. With more digging, I found a preliminary death entry. Male, late 70s. Deceased at home, natural causes. The name again, Walter Green. So he existed. But that did not answer any of the questions the box had raised. If anything, it made them stranger. Over the next week, pieces of his history began to surface in small, unexpected ways. One afternoon, a white sedan with government plates stopped in front of his house. Two men in plain suits walked up to the door and let themselves in with what looked like an official master key. They stayed for an hour. They did not look like real estate agents or relatives. They looked like people used to walking into rooms that belonged to the dead. I did not speak to them. Instead, I did what any stubborn woman with an internet connection and too much time in the evenings might do. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. I had never filed one before. I sat at my dining room table with my laptop and tried to frame my curiosity in official language. I knew FOIA requests were not magic keys. I also knew that if there was anything about my neighbor that touched federal agencies or the U.S. Marshals, it was unlikely they would simply hand it over. Still, I had his name, his address, the approximate year he moved in, the date of his death. I wrote it all down, explaining that I was a neighbor seeking any publicly releasable information relating to the deceased individual who had resided at that address, especially in connection with any federal program or protective status. A few weeks later, I got a letter. It did not answer my questions. It mostly acknowledged that my request had been received and that certain records, if they existed, might be exempt from release. But buried in the formal language was one phrase that made the hairs on my arms lift slightly. The agency could neither confirm nor deny the existence of records relating to an individual who might have been associated with protective measures in the past. Protective measures. I did not know exactly what that meant, but it was enough of a thread to pull on. I started reading. I learned more about the Witness Security Program than I ever thought I would. Officially, it is called the Witness Security Program, or WITSEC. Identities changed, records sealed, people uprooted and told to blend in and never look back. The more I read, the more my neighbor started to look different in my memory. His lack of family photos, his absence of visitors, the way he seemed at home and yet unanchored, like he had learned how to live in a place without ever fully landing. The porch light, the habit of waving but rarely stopping to chat. None of those things were proof, but together, they began to feel less like quirks and more like artifacts of a life built on caution. I still needed something concrete, something that tied the man who called himself Walter Green to a past that required multiple passports and aliases. I got my first real clue from the most ordinary place imaginable. The library. At the city library, a patient reference librarian showed me how to search old newspaper archives. I spent days combing through stories about corruption and drug cases until I finally found a small 1987 article about a major racketeering conviction. It described a key witness, unnamed, whose testimony had been crucial and who had been relocated with the help of the U.S. Marshals Service after a previous attempt on his life. For the first time, I felt something close to certainty. The details were vague, but they matched the shape of what I had been circling. A man involved in something dangerous enough to require protection, important enough that multiple identities might have been necessary, roughly the right age. Still, I needed more. The librarian suggested something I had not considered: retired law enforcement. She told me about a local history group that met once a month above the library, mostly retired police officers and firefighters. If anyone remembered a federal case that touched our area, it would be one of them. I went to their next meeting. After listening for a while, I mentioned gently that I had been a neighbor to a man who might have been under some kind of protection. I described him: older, white-haired, quiet, living alone in a stucco house in our suburb, arrived in the early 2000s. For a moment, there was nothing. Then one of the older men tilted his head and asked if my neighbor had ever mentioned the U.S. Marshals. I said he had not mentioned much of anything at all. The retired officer said that in the early 2000s, there had been some quiet coordination with federal agents about placing someone in our area. The man was not their case originally, but the Marshals had arranged with local law enforcement to be aware of his presence. The officer had been briefed because his team might have been first responders if anything went wrong. He could not tell me much. Some of it was still sensitive, he said, but he did say this: the man had testified in a large federal case against a criminal organization that did business in multiple states, including ours. His testimony helped put away people who did not forgive easily. The Marshals had moved him more than once. Each move came with a new name, a new background story, a new stack of documents. By the time he came here, the danger had faded from a roaring fire to a slow, smoldering threat. But it never went out completely. The retired officer remembered the man as cautious but polite. They had spoken only once, when he came by in plain clothes to reassure him that local law enforcement was aware of his situation and would not draw attention to him. The man had seemed tired and very alone. He did not tell me the man's original name. That part was not his to give. Still, I left that meeting with something I had not had before: corroboration. My quiet neighbor, the man with the multiple passports and driver's licenses, had likely been living under a series of carefully constructed identities for decades. Somewhere in his past was a life so dangerous he had to trade it in for a long chapter of anonymity in our little Arizona suburb. The for sale sign in his yard sprouted a small red tag one afternoon: under contract. Life moved on. I thought that might be the end of it. I had, in a way, answered the question that had been gnawing at me. Who was he? Or at least what kind of man he had been? A witness, a participant in something dangerous, a survivor who faded himself into the background so thoroughly that when he died, most people on our street described him as quiet and nothing more. But the story was not finished with me. The final piece arrived in my mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday. It was a plain white envelope, no return address. My name and address were written in neat, careful handwriting. The postmark was local. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. The letter was short. The writer said they were part of the team that had gone through Walter's belongings after his death, not for the estate sale, but for a different inventory. Among the personal papers, a note had been found with my address on it. The note, the writer explained, had been tucked inside a folder labeled "Personal" in Walter's handwriting. In that folder were a photograph of our street, a yellowed clipping about the trial I had read about, and a separate sheet of paper. On that sheet was a message. It was addressed not to a specific person, but to a group, to the people who made this place feel like home. The writer said they felt it was right that someone on the street saw it. What followed in the letter was a paraphrase, but the essence was clear. Walter had written that he had come to our street expecting to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, always the outsider on the block, the man who waved but never really belonged anywhere. He wrote that he had been wrong. He mentioned small things: the way people brought in each other's trash cans when someone was out of town, the time a neighbor shoveled his driveway after an unusual cold snap, the way kids on bicycles rode past his house and called him Mister, even though they knew nothing about him except that he sometimes gave out the good candy at Halloween. He wrote that he had missed having a home more than he realized. Not a safe house or a temporary apartment or a hotel registered under a name that did not feel like his, but a real home, where the creak in the floorboard by the bedroom door became familiar, and the shadows at sunset always fell in the same places on the living room wall. He said that our street had given him that. He also wrote that he had never told anyone here who he used to be, not because he did not trust us, but because the person he had been before had brought enough harm into the world. He did not want that version of himself to live here too. So instead, he had chosen to live as the man he wished he had been all along: a decent neighbor, a quiet presence, a pair of hands ready to help if someone needed them. He could not undo his past, he wrote, but he could choose what kind of man he was in the time he had left. The letter from the inventory officer ended with a simple line. They said they could not share more, but felt it was important that someone who had known him, even in the limited way neighbors do, understood that he had been grateful. For 20 years, I had thought of Walter as a blank space on our street, a quiet man who waved, who kept to himself, who seemed to neither need nor expect anything from the people around him. I had assumed his solitude was a preference. In reality, it had been, at least in part, a burden. He had lived under layers of protection and secrecy meant to keep him alive. Those layers had also kept him at a distance. Yet within that distance he had found small ways to connect: returning a stray trash can, leaving an envelope anonymously in the neighborhood collection for a family who lost their job, dropping off a bag of groceries at the food pantry without leaving a name. Maybe those acts were his way of balancing scales only he could see. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about the choices we make when no one knows who we used to be. Most of us cannot step into a new name, but in small ways, we still decide what kind of neighbor, what kind of person we are. Walter, whatever his original name had been, chose to spend the last part of his life as a decent neighbor who harmed no one on our street, watched out for the kids, and quietly helped when he could. He never asked us to know his story. He simply lived among us as a neighbor. Sometimes I walk past his old house and think about the note he left. To the people who made this place feel like home. He could not undo his past, but in a small stucco house in an ordinary Arizona suburb, a little decency gave him something like peace. Now, when I see a new neighbor walking their dog or struggling with groceries, I try not to assume I know their story. Maybe they are exactly who they appear to be. Maybe they are carrying a heavier past. Either way, I can choose to meet them with the kind of simple kindness that, for a man who lived under borrowed names, was enough to turn a hiding place into a home.